What we'll be looking at today are functions in JavaScript. If you clicked on this video, you're probably unsure when to use functions and how they actually work. They're one of the most fundamental concepts you're going to encounter in JavaScript. JavaScript, basically everywhere where you look, you're going to find functions. So you need to have a good grasp of what they actually do. So if we go into the code, I'm here in an online code editor. If I say, for example, I have some code that I want to run, let's say, for example, I want to log out hello world, right? The standard. Now, let's say, and if I run this, right, you're going to see here that in the output, I see hello world. Now, if I want to run this multiple times throughout my whole program, I might get into the problem that everywhere where I do this, right, let's say I have this another few times, if I now say I don't want to say hello world anymore, but instead I want to say bye, I now have to change it in 5 different places. Now that's not really what we want to do. In this case, what we'd rather have is one central place where we have this kind of code stored, and then we can just change it there and use it or reuse it anywhere within our code in its current state. In other words, a function. That's exactly what a function does. A function is going to store any block of code that you're writing and then make it reusable. You're basically just saying, I'm going to give this code that I'm having in here a name. If we also make it longer, it makes even more sense. Like if I say, for example, const greeting, and I call this hello world, and then afterwards I go and say, well, I want to log out the greeting like this, right? Now it's a block of code. It's not just one line. And I can just say, I want to name this whole thing, and then whenever I call its name, it will run that particular code. Now, when I added this second line, now you can maybe see it a little bit more clearly that it's a block of code. And every time I want to now run this block of code, I can just call its function. I can just basically say, this is now going to be named greet world, okay? So I can just say, well, I'm going to make this a function. That means the function keyword. And then the function keyword I can say is greet world. And then parentheses, we'll talk about these later. And then the syntax convention is I'm going to use an opening brace and a closing brace. Just like that. And everything that is supposed to be inside of the function, all the code that should be run whenever I say I want to run greet world, should be inside of here. And that is it. If I now say I want to have, actually, let me comment all of this out, and I rerun this, you're going to see, there we go, now it's running, you're going to see nothing. Nothing is put out right now, because what we've done right now is we've only defined the function. We're not actually calling it. So right now, I have within my program a space where I said, okay, well, greet world is a function, and if it's called, it should run these 2 lines, but I've never actually called it. So for me to make that work, I now have to say greet world. And when I do that, and I rerun my code, there we go. You see now we're back to hello world. And that's the very basis of functions, right? Conceptually, you have some block of code, you want to name it so that you can then reuse it wherever you want. Because, for example, again, if I have multiple places where I'm doing greet world, and now again, I'm changing my string to instead of hello world, hello YouTube, and I rerun it, you're going to see that in all the places, we're getting now the hello YouTube string. I don't have to go everywhere in my code individually and say, okay, I want to change that specific string. You make your code easier to maintain, which is one of the key things you always have to look at when you're thinking about your code quality. So functions are incredibly important for that. Now, if you want to go deeper into functions, functions don't have to be this static, right? Right now, if I call greet world, it will always have the same result. But what I can do with functions is I can basically tell it, depending on some input, change whatever comes out of the function, right? So right now it's different whether I say hello world or hello YouTube, but I can actually make this an input in my function as well. So where I put this is on the first line. This here is also what you call the function signature. You define that this is going to be a function, you give it its name, and then these parentheses in here are going to get the parameters of the function. So one of my parameters here could be actually the greeting. So I'm going to say I'm expecting a greeting to come in here, and depending on the greeting, my string will be changed. So in this case here, I can now say, well, my greet world function should be dependent on whatever I need to greet in that code. So if I now say, for example, the first instance, I want to greet hello world. The second instance, I'm going to greet, the other way around. The first instance, I'm going to say hello world. The first instance, I'm going to say hello YouTube. The second instance, I'm going to say hello world. And the third one, I'm just going to comment out for now. If I now run this again, you're going to see hello YouTube, hello world, depending on the input. Which again is cool, but I can have even more flexibility. I can go and say, well, I do want to have it that when I don't pass any argument into my function, I want it to just display hello world. That should be my default value for the functions. If I run this again, you're going to see though that I get undefined, because right now greeting will be depending on whatever gets passed into the function. So what I can do here is I can say, well, greeting should be equal to hello world. And now what are we going to get? Well, if I run this again, the first time I should get hello YouTube. The second time I should get hello world. And here, when I don't pass anything into it, it should also say hello world. Because by default, if this is not getting passed in, we're going to use the underlying hello world string. So running this again, we see exactly that. Now, functions are obviously a lot more, can get a lot more complex than what we're seeing here in this toy example. For example, we can have multiple parameters coming in. So instead here, I can say, well, I want to have the greeting, but I would also have who to greet as my other variable. Again, I can make this as default variables, but let's stick to this for now. And I can just go and say, well, what I would like to log out here is the greeting and then who to greet. If you're not familiar yet with this syntax, it's just a string interpolation where I'm basically using these backticks to then include the variables right in that string. If it doesn't make sense, look it up. But for now, really what I'm trying to do is here, I'm trying to combine the two parameters. And again, I can say, I'm going to have a default value of hello, and who to greet will by default be world. Now, if I go in the first one and I say Guten Tag and Welt, and in the second one I don't say anything, right here, and I run all of this again, we're going to get Guten Tag Welt and then hello world as the default values. Okay? And that is generally the idea of using arguments in functions. There's not much more to it. There's obviously a lot more data structures you can pass in. Like right now I'm just passing in strings, I'm just passing in strings, I'm not passing in anything more advanced like arrays and objects. So my function is very, very simple. But generally, everything you want to work with within a function gets passed here in the function signature. Now, at the moment, this function here runs some code, but that code doesn't actually return anything back to the main program. So one very key thing is the return statement within the function. So right here you see, so far I only told you about the function signature and then the function code block. The code block in the curly braces, the function signature the first line. But now what I would like to do is I basically want to build my greeting within this function and then use that in the rest of my code. So usually functions return something from their code block, because this thing right here, whatever I pass in here, I don't have access outside of it. So for example, if I go and say const finished string, and I just go and say, well, that is going to be my greeting, and then who to greet, like that. And I then say in here, I want to console log the finished string. You're going to see the greeting. If I then go outside, let's get rid of this. If I then go outside and I say console log the finished string, I don't actually have access to finished string. You're going to see now an error. You first see hello world. That's happening inside of here when I call the function right here. But then when I say console log finished string, I get a reference error because it's not defined. It only lives within this code block. So what do we do? Well, one way to do this is we can return the finished string from our function, and then over here I can go and say, well, const, so I'm defining a new variable, and I call this return string, which is not a great variable name, but for now it will do, greet world. And then out of here, I'm just going to log out the return string. Okay, if I run this, you're going to see it works now. So what the return statement basically gives me is the ability to pass some information from within my function outside of its scope to the overall program. Okay, so that is what you can understand about the return statement. It makes anything that you're doing within that function, within that code block, available outside of the function. Just a last bit of information on things that students often get wrong. Anytime you look within JavaScript and you see these parentheses, you can think function. A function is being called. And that is really important to understand, that anytime you see those parentheses, it basically means in that moment, a function is running. Because what I could also do here is I could say return string equals greet world, okay? But if I run this, what you're going to see, oops, actually I can have the return string here as well. If I run this, what you're going to see is nothing in terms of a greeting, but instead you see here that greet world is printed out, okay? You see it in the output. But just the function name, and it gives me the information that this is a function. What does that actually mean? Well, it means that it's telling us here greet world is a function. I told you at the beginning, we're naming code blocks. We're having whole blocks of code, and those will be given a name. In this case here, we're giving it a name of greet world. So from now on, I can reference it. I can say, well, I want to, for example, now assign whatever is assigned to greet world, which is a function, to another variable. You're not going to do this very often in this kind of style, but you will at some point start passing functions to other functions. Then it's going to be very important that you understand that this here is the way to pass one function to another. But if I want to run it, I always have to use the parentheses. Okay, so just make sure you understand that. If you want to learn about that, how to pass functions to other functions, also how to work with arrow functions, how to work with higher order functions, what callback functions are, any other basic JavaScript concepts, first of all, let me know about them in the comments, but also please subscribe, because I will be uploading a lot more videos on the basic JavaScript programming concepts in the future on this channel. Until then, thank you so much for watching. Peace.